The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time, and all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This legislative hearing is entitled H.R. 4311, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act of 2017. Without objection, the gentleman from California, Mr. Royce, is permitted to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Mr. Royce is a member of the Financial Services Committee and is chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. We appreciate his interest in this topic. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes to give an opening statement. The world today is a much more dangerous place than it was at the turn of the century. In 2000, post-Soviet Russia seemed fitfully to be moving towards recovery from nearly a century of communist rule. China, while still communist run, seemed a useful partner, a low-cost manufacturing platform eager for work. Terrorism had not yet become a global problem. But today, terrorism is an ever-present threat. Russia has undertaken a disturbing series of military and cyber interventions against its neighbors and the United States, and China has become a global economic powerhouse that will stop at nothing to enhance its military muscle. Against this backdrop, our colleague, Representative Pittenger, more than a year ago, began a thoughtful examination of the process by which the government screens inbound investment to ensure it presents no threat to national security. The Interagency Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, last was updated in 2007. Since then, a number of deals have been broken up when CFIUS detected threats that could not be mitigated by changes in the proposals. Significantly, each denied proposal was rejected because of fears it would result in Chinese control of a technology or a business that would have threatened national security. Not all deals from China are bad, and not all bad deals are from China, but the dramatic increase in the number, size, and complexity of deals CFIUS scanned last year, combined with the notable rise in the percentage of deals that have Chinese ties, is a clear indicator that we should examine ways to modernize the CFIUS process as we head into the 3rd decade of the 21st century. So today, after 3 hearings on CFIUS's operations and challenges, we start examining legislation introduced in November, H.R. 4311, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA, as it is commonly known. The administration supports the legislation and has worked since its introduction to develop updated language in response to constructive feedback and suggestions from interested parties. Additionally, the authors of FIRMA have done the same, and the committee is currently reviewing several proposals to enhance the legislation further. As we proceed down this road of much-needed CFIUS modernization, my goal is that we continue to work in a bipartisan and bicameral manner through the regular order process, because we all know that CFIUS reform is critical to our national security, and we need to make sure we get it right. We must work quickly, but we must not hastily rush something of this magnitude that could lead to unintended consequences that jeopardize our national security and shackle our economy. We need reforms to effectively target and focus on real threats rather than all joint ventures and investments. We cannot inadvertently ensnare purely benign investments which do not involve critical or emerging technologies and which are wholly disconnected from U.S. national security concerns. Together, we must stop troublesome investments by Chinese state-controlled enterprises bent on securing technology that would threaten our national security, while also being careful not to drive away unobjectionable deals that create jobs and opportunities for Americans of all walks of life. I am confident that together we can improve our national security without harming our economy, but it will require hard work, patience, and undoubtedly some give and take to come up with the right solution. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, for 3.5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and for convening this hearing. In the 10 years since Congress last authorized CFIUS, our strategic competitors have found gaps in the CFIUS process, which they're exploiting. Right now, if foreign intelligence agencies want to buy land to help spy on our most sensitive national security installation, and there's no existing business on the site, CFIUS can't stop them. Right now, investments that could give our strategic competitors influence and insight into critical technology companies go unreviewed because they fall just short of control of the company. Right now, if a strategic competitor seizes control of a U.S. business through a change in the legal rights associated with an existing investment, CFIUS can't stop them. Right now, our strategic competitors can structure transactions to take advantage of a loophole between CFIUS's existing authority over joint ventures involving a whole U.S. business and the Export Control Systems Authority over individual pieces of technology and know-how. And all this needs to stop right now if we want to avoid a catastrophic amount of damage to our technological edge and our military readiness. And that's why I was pleased to join with Congressman Pittenger and Senator Feinstein and Senator Cornyn. Fundamentally, FIRMA is about closing each of these specific gaps I just spoke about while making sure that the U.S. remains welcoming to investments that do not harm our national security. Throughout this process, Congressman Pittenger and I and our Senate counterparts have been working closely with stakeholders and the CFIUS agencies to refine and perfect the bill. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter the latest working draft of FIRMA into the record.
Without objection.
While our witnesses are testifying on the bill as introduced, I would urge my colleagues to see how we have addressed many of the issues that have been raised in our revised text. I think my staff and I have already met with all but one of our witnesses who are here today as a part of that process. Mr. Marchick, our door is open if you'd also like to come in. And your input has played an important role in this process, notwithstanding the lack of physical presence thus far. I am glad we are working on this issue in a bipartisan way. I echo the remarks of the chair, and I extend to him once again my gratitude for the manner in which we have undertaken this task, this very important task. I am, for my own part, happy to work with anyone who is willing to come to the table in good faith. Because at the end of the day, my colleagues, this issue, our national security, is too important for anything less. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the author of FIRMA, the gentleman from North Carolina, Congressman Pittenger, for a 2-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you clearly for hosting this very important hearing. Before I begin my prepared remarks, I would like to thank my good friend, Mr. Heck, for his leadership with me on this bill. He has been a remarkable partner. Also, thank you for submitting to the record the most current version of the bill, 3.0, which has a collective input of many of you. I know, Mr. Comer, we've worked with you significantly on that input for the last several months, and many other people in the industry. I would also like to say that our offices work with Senator Cornyn and Treasury Department, along with the various members of the industry, to make sure that we provide a bill that's responsive, that gets the job done, but make sure that we have open markets. These updates streamline the bill as we have responded to the concerns raised by industry, and it makes it even more laser-focused on national security. Well, I would have hoped that we would hear a more clear presentation today, as I understand that perhaps these edits are not included in the testimony. I'm happy that we can share this product of our work into the record. And Mr. Chairman, I do thank you for offering unanimous consent to enter into the record the most update of FIRMA. Mr. Chairman, CFIUS reform is an urgent national security requirement. President Trump has endorsed this bill. Secretary Mattis requested the bill and endorsed it. Secretary Mnuchin and his team have worked closely and tirelessly on this bill and have also endorsed it. FIRMA is specifically targeted to address national security issues related to defense applicable technology transfers to China and other countries, issues that remain unresolved and outside the scope of existing export control. Those who disagree with the premise of my bill should speak to the 5 Department of Defense secretaries who have endorsed this bill. Unfortunately, many who profit from modernizing the Chinese military seek, some do, to distort the narrative and defeat this bill. Today, we have many witnesses who will make presentations who, notwithstanding, represent interests from China, Lenovo, and other major entities. General Dunford has said that China will be the greatest threat to the U.S. by 2025. Yet some companies insist on accelerating that timeline and defeating FIRMA. Mr. Chairman, national security experts have spoken. FIRMA is needed, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to get it passed in its current form, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for a 3.5-minute opening statement.
This is an important bill. I think it needs to be stronger. I'm working with the authors on 3 ideas that so far are not included, but we continue to try to persuade them. The first, I think, will eventually be included. It is a no-brainer, and that is it should be explicit that only under truly extraordinary circumstances would we entertain an application from any country, from a company based in any country that is a state sponsor of terrorism. We may want to go further and say we don't want to entertain an application from any company that does business in or with any state sponsor of terrorism. National security starts with clamping down on state sponsors of terrorism. Second, as to critical technologies, the issue is often an investment is made when a company does not have critical technologies or hasn't proven it, or we don't understand how important it is. Those transactions need to be subject to post-transaction review when a country of special concern is at issue. Otherwise, we can be in a circumstance where our technological crown jewels find their way to Beijing simply because we didn't realize the importance of the technology at the time of the transaction, or the company didn't have the technology at the time of the transaction. It had the elements of the technology and the scientists that would create the technology. Third, we should consider jobs in every decision we make in Washington, and that includes foreign investment. Other countries, every other country I'm aware of, does just that. Fourth is an idea I have not shared with the authors yet, and that is that the critical technologies concept needs also to be applied to soft power. Our media, the minds of Americans, are just as important as the technology. I, for example, am worried that the Chinese control a big chunk of the movie screens in the United States, AMC in particular. What that means is that if you make a movie that Beijing doesn't like, you can't get it, not only can't you get it shown in China, you can't get it shown in the United States. At very minimum, before AMC was purchased, there should have been a provision where the owners agree not to discriminate against a movie simply because its content is disagreed with by the government of China, and a requirement that when there is a movie made that the Chinese government doesn't like, and other movie distributors and screens and theater owners are showing it, that it should be available at AMC theaters again. To give China control of the minds of Americans by controlling the media of the United States was a mistake that we can reverse, perhaps in this bill. So I look forward to working with the authors to make this bill stronger, and now is not the time to put profits ahead of national security. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of this committee, the gentleman from California, Congressman Royce, for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you. Our long-term national security and economic interests, Mr. Chairman, are directly tied to how we protect emerging critical technologies. And my view remains that the U.S. should pursue a whole-of-government strategy that does not rely exclusively on CFIUS or exclusively on export controls, but builds strength on strength, reforming both complementary approaches which together represent a comprehensive response to a very critical national security challenge that we are facing right now. One specific issue that I want to raise is the fact that export controls not only restrict the transfer of products, but also of know-how. We should all think long and hard on this. This is current law. Both defense trade controls managed by the State Department and dual-use export controls at Commerce control the transfer of intangible ideas to foreign persons. But this is an area where we should strengthen the law. I agree with my good friend from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, that greater scrutiny is required with respect to the transfer of know-how, legally or otherwise, to strategic economic competitors, such as Beijing. And that is why the Foreign Affairs Committee Export Control Reform Bill, which we consider next week in a markup, explicitly ensures that sensitive know-how, which may include such items as written or oral communication, blueprints, engineering designs and specifications, at any stage of their development prior to production, would be subject to controls. Likewise, that is why our bill will also make clear that export controls apply regardless of the nature of the underlying transaction. We need to think on this, whether through a purchase order or other contract requirement, voluntary decision, whether such a purchase order or other contract or intercompany agreement or during a joint venture or a similar collaborative arrangement exists. All that has to be controlled, and we owe it to the American people to get it right. I'm hopeful that we can take the best of both committees' work and move forward with a comprehensive, whole-of-government strategy that will counter China's efforts and other adversarial efforts to acquire sensitive U.S. technologies. I yield back. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. And today we welcome the testimony of the Honorable Clay Lowry, Managing Director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, where he focuses on international financial regulation, sovereign debt, macroeconomic policies, exchange rates, and investment policy. Mr. Lowry served as the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department from 2005 to 2009, where he chaired CFIUS and was instrumental in the 2007 CFIUS reform effort. Jonathan Calmer, Senior Vice President of Global Policy for the Information Technology Industry Council. Before joining ITI in February 2015, Jonathan was counsel in the International Trade and International Dispute Resolution groups of Crowell & Mooring, where he helped companies overcome regulatory and market access barriers in foreign markets. From 2007 to 2012, Jonathan served as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Investment, where he was responsible for developing and implementing U.S. international investment policy and negotiating with foreign governments to secure greater market access and better treatment for U.S. companies abroad. David Marchick is Managing Director and Global Head of External Affairs at the Carlyle Group. Prior to joining Carlyle, Mr. Marchick was a partner and vice chair of the International Practice Group at Covington and Burling. In the Clinton administration, Mr. Marchick served at the White House, USTR, as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy and Transportation Affairs at the Department of State, and Principal Deputy Assistant for Trade Development at the Department of Commerce, where he worked extensively on CFIUS matters. Michael Brown is a Presidential Innovation Fellow for the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental. Through August of 2016, Michael was the CEO of Symantec Corporation. During his tenure as CEO, which was from 2014 to 2016, he led a turnaround as the company developed a new strategy focused on its security business. Michael is the former chairman and CEO of Quantum Corporation, which specialized in computer backup and archiving products. Michael also has served as the chairman of EqualLogic and Line 6, and has served on the public boards of Nectar Therapeutics, Maxtor Corporation, and Digital Impact. Ms. Giovanna Cinelli is a partner at Morgan, Lewis & Bockius, where she is a leader on international trade, national security, and economic sanctions. As a practitioner for more than 25 years, she counsels clients in the defense and high technology sectors on a broad range of issues affecting national security, CFIUS, and export controls, including complex export compliance matters, audits, cross-border due diligence, and export enforcement. Each of you will be recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of the record. The Honorable Clay Lowry will begin, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes. If you could just hit your button there.
Sorry about that. Chairman Barr, members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify on FIRMA. In my written testimony and today, I'll discuss my general support for FIRMA while pointing out what I consider to be several key shortcomings in the current bill, particularly from the perspective of someone who had to implement a major reform of CFIUS in the past. Before I discuss these issues, however, I wanted to say a few words about the rationale behind this bill, which is highlighted by a number of the statements we've just heard, as well as by Michael Brown's report that he did for the DIUX, and that is the growing threat posed by China. China's strategy incorporates such government efforts to fuse the military and civilian sectors, subsidize industries and individual companies, support cyber espionage, and use restrictions on foreign investment and licensing to coerce technology transfers, and probably much more. The United States must address this issue and growing challenge in a comprehensive manner that goes well beyond the scope of this hearing. And the FIRMA bill is one important step, and I think this bill gets a number of things right, which I have detailed in my written testimony. However, I worry that portions of this bill use vague language, duplicate existing export control authority, and will be overly burdensome for both the private sector and government. In my previous testimonies or speeches on CFIUS in the past, I've always begun with a litany of statistics about the importance of foreign direct investment to economic growth. I'm not doing that today, and that's because FIRMA is only partially about foreign investment in the United States. Instead, there's a substantial part of the bill that transforms CFIUS into a technology control regime in which there isn't a merger, there isn't an acquisition, there isn't a foreign direct investment in the United States. My concerns stem from my experience in implementing the last CFIUS modernization legislation in 2007. And FIRMA's language leaves too many terms to be defined and interpreted, such that there's a distinct possibility of unintended changes or unforeseen consequences. This committee is all too familiar with what that can mean. Let me give you an example. The Volcker Rule, which may be a sound idea, but has led to an overly complex rule that is vague, burdensome, and essentially a regulatory nightmare for both the regulators and for the financial institutions they regulate. As members of this committee, I presume that you have heard from your constituents about these consequences. I see a similar lesson being learned about FIRMA. Similar transactions create anomalous results, and we should worry about creating a guessing game for U.S. companies that require hours of legal analysis of complex transactions and structures when their non-U.S. competitors are not burdened with anything even remotely similar. The FIRMA bill has left many terms to be undefined or ill-defined. For instance, what is the sector of critical technologies, emerging technologies we should worry about? What are the subsectors? Do we need a list? This leads to my second concern, which with FIRMA, which is it duplicates our export control regime. This bill seems to suggest that CFIUS, a group of roughly 100 people who don't have subject matter expertise, will be able to identify emerging technologies better than the roughly 500 people we have at Defense, Commerce, and State that are already working on these export control issues every day. And which leads to my final concern I'd like to highlight, which is the burden. Today, CFIUS reviews approximately 200 transactions a year. Over the preceding few months, I don't think there has been a single government witness, CFIUS practitioner, or CFIUS expert who has testified before this committee or the Senate Banking Committee who has not said that significantly more resources are needed for CFIUS. With FIRMA, however, the number of transactions under review will go from 200 a year to several thousand. If this expansion is truly necessary for our national security and costs is the only issue, as Congressman Sherman mentioned, then by all means, let's find a way to pay for it. But this expansion is not driven by national security. Instead, it's the needless result of a bill that is too vague and too duplicative, rendering it practically impossible for CFIUS to accomplish the work it has been tasked to do, and that is so vital to our economic and national security. To conclude, let me reiterate that I am broadly supportive of the CFIUS modernization effort. But I think more work is needed to ensure that the outcome does not have the unintended consequences of chilling investment in the United States and harming our competitiveness around the world, both of which are important to our economic strength, the backbone of President Trump's national security strategy. In addition, adding the implementation risk I've tried to identify in my written testimony could destabilize the excellent and so far targeted work that CFIUS currently performs. In other words, I would humbly suggest that without fixing this bill, we could harm our national security, not enhance it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Culmer, you're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Barr, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss this critically important piece of legislation. My name is Josh Calmer, and I'm Senior Vice President for Global Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI. ITI is a collection of 63 of the world's most innovative companies, representing every part of the technology sector. Our companies do business across borders on a daily basis and therefore have a keen interest in this legislation.
Sir, could you pull the microphone a little closer to? Thank you.
Is that better? I also have a personal perspective on this bill. As you mentioned, several years ago, I served as Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Investment and represented USTR on CFIUS. In that role, I was involved in the review of hundreds of transactions, regularly participated in political level meetings regarding sensitive deals, and helped draft regulations during the last modernization of CFIUS a decade ago. Before discussing the bill, let me first say how much we've appreciated the open and constructive spirit in which you and your colleagues, as well as your staffs, have worked during this process. I'd particularly like to recognize Representatives Pittenger and Heck for your leadership, as well as that of Senators Cornyn and Feinstein. While this hearing focuses on the bill as introduced, I'd be happy also to discuss the additional ideas that we and others have offered to improve the bill. So I can reduce our position on the bill as introduced to 3 main points. The first is that the national security concerns are real, and FIRMA is a critical part of the solution. The United States has benefited greatly from its longstanding openness to foreign investment. Yet the U.S. government has no more solemn and important responsibility than to protect the nation's security. So we have to pursue our commitment to open investment consistent with that imperative. Our organization and every single one of our companies agree with the national security objectives of this bill. We also agree that the bill's advocates have identified a compelling set of emerging national security risks that the U.S. government must immediately address. FIRMA would do that in many important ways, including by enabling CFIUS to review certain real estate transactions near military facilities, expanding the list of national security factors that CFIUS can consider, improving compliance with mitigation agreements, and ensuring that CFIUS is fully resourced. My second point is that there are nevertheless important differences of view about how to deal with emerging critical technologies. I think we all share the goal of strengthening national security, but we have some healthy disagreements about how best to do so, and we offer our views in a spirit of open and respectful debate. Our main misgiving with the bill as introduced relates to the proposed expansion of CFIUS jurisdiction to cover outbound transfers of U.S. intellectual property. As we read it, the language would capture the constant motion of companies' everyday business, putting them in a position of perpetual uncertainty over whether they are obliged to file with CFIUS simply to go about their daily work. This uncertainty would not only impact companies, it would overwhelm CFIUS with cases, chill the U.S. business environment, and potentially deplete our industrial base. The core problem is that the risks we're talking about have to do with technology, not transactions. It's true that unfriendly countries could use certain technologies to harm U.S. national security, but that's the case regardless of business arrangement. If the disclosure of technologies would raise national security concerns, we need to address those concerns, full stop. I will say that on this point in particular, the bill's advocates in both Congress and the administration have responded meaningfully and in good faith to our proposed improvements. While important distance remains, we're grateful for their responsiveness and we feel good about the trajectory of the discussion. My final point is that we already have the legal tools we need, but we have to reinforce them with additional commitment, creativity, and resources. We believe that U.S. export control laws already address virtually all, if not all, of the national security risks associated with emerging critical technologies. We also recognize that it doesn't matter if export controls can address the risks legally if they can't do so practically. So our shared objective, in our view, ought to be to bolster our export control system, politically, institutionally, and financially, to ensure that it can meet the challenges we now face. We think about the challenge here as one of creating connective tissue between FIRMA and the export control system so that our export control laws can aggressively and proactively address risks coming over the horizon. I've discussed two possible ideas for doing this in my written testimony, and I'd be pleased to discuss them further here. What matters from our perspective is that the export control authorities do the heavy lifting to identify, describe, and list critical emerging technologies of concern, while ensuring that CFIUS has visibility into the process and the opportunity to weigh in as well. I'll conclude my remarks there, but let me thank you again for having me and reiterate our commitment both to the success of FIRMA and to working constructively with this subcommittee and the Congress as a whole to achieve it. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Calmer. Mr. Marchik, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I also want to thank you, Congressman Pittenger, for your good work on this and that of your staff, Congressman Heck as well. Thank you very much. I was here 2006 testifying before this committee on the previous update. I had a little more hair and a smaller waistline at that point, but otherwise the issues are pretty much the same. So I'm going to talk about 4 principles which I hope you'll consider. I do understand, I haven't read version 3.0, but I do understand that some of these issues were addressed, and I thank you for that. First point is that CFIUS absolutely needs the tools to block or mitigate investments that have a national security impact. To my knowledge, CFIUS has already been using that authority to great effect. The number of transactions that have been effectively blocked in the last few years has increased significantly. In 2016, there were 27 deals blocked, which is a record. I also understand that in 2017, according to the Rhodium Group, that more than $8 billion of investments from China was blocked, also a record. So I'm not familiar with the specifics of these cases that were blocked, but I would just point out that CFIUS is a very powerful tool, and they have not been shy in using it. Second is that CFIUS should be tailored to scrutinize those transactions that raise national security risks, but allow all the rest of the deals that don't raise concerns to go through quickly. I think this is an issue that many members of the committee would agree with in terms of efficiency in government and the efficiency in approval processes. I've frequently analogize CFIUS to triage in an emergency room. In an emergency room where you're overwhelmed with patients, a good emergency room will focus intensively on those patients that need the most help, but get the kids out that have a nick or a cut quickly. CFIUS should do the same, and your legislation should allow and direct CFIUS to do this. In other words, focus on those transactions that matter. In the M&A world, time is money, and the uncertainty associated with lengthy regulatory reviews reduces investment. And so hopefully your legislation will enable CFIUS to focus on those transactions that matter and push the others through quickly. Third, casting too wide a net will actually hurt national security rather than help, because the system will be overwhelmed. When I testified in 2006 before this committee, I noted that CFIUS at that point was then overwhelmed with cases, and the non-controversial transactions, ones from the UK, Canada, other allies, were being slowed down. And that year, they reviewed 113, and 7 went to a second phase investigation, only 7. Last year, CFIUS reviewed 240, and more than 70% went to a second phase. And more than half of the transactions were from countries that were NATO allies, the UK, Canada, and others. So the question is, how can you design legislation that encourages CFIUS to focus on the cases that matter, but allow the others to go quickly through? Finally, I'd encourage the committee to look at the passive investment provisions that are crafted. Passive investment is just that, it's passive. So when you and I invest in a 401k, or you invest in TSP, or an investor invests with a private equity, venture capital, or real estate firm, they're entrusting money to the managers. And those managers can invest, manage, operate, hire, fire, sell, how they want. The investors don't tell them what to do. As long as those investors are truly passive, then CFIUS should not subject those transactions to its jurisdiction. And I think that the language is a little broad. I understand that in the next version, you've addressed some of these issues, and I'm grateful for that. I will stop there. Those are the 4 points I would like to offer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Barr and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be with you to share findings of work I've led in understanding the role that Chinese investment has in a systematic plan to transfer technology. Because of this work, I'm a strong supporter of FIRMA. I came to this work as a former CEO of two large Silicon Valley companies, Quantum and Symantec, but in my career I've also worked as an investor, board member, and chairman of several early-stage companies, both in Silicon Valley and in the Boston area. I'm here today in my personal capacity as a Presidential Innovation Fellow and not as a spokesperson for the Defense Department. In the fall of 2016, at the request of then Defense Secretary Carter and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Selva, I began researching, along with Pavneet Singh, whether and how China is transferring technology through investments in early-stage firms. In summary, what we learned was that China's participation in venture deal financing was at a record level of 16% of all venture deals financed in 2015 and remained at 11% in the first 10 months of 2017. This is concerning for several reasons. First, the growth of these investments is up substantially from a level of 1 to 6% in the period 2010 to 2014. We identified more than 500 Chinese-based or affiliated entities investing in U.S. early-stage companies. Second, the technologies where Chinese firms are investing are the same dual-use technologies where U.S. venture firms are investing, those that will be foundational to future innovations such as AI, autonomous vehicles, augmented reality, blockchain, and genetic engineering. Third, since venture capital investing depends on deal flow, investors see many more deals than they invest in. As a result, it's likely that Chinese investors in aggregate have seen upwards of half of recent U.S. venture financings. In other words, Chinese investors have a broad view of U.S. innovation across a range of technologies. Fourth, by investing in early-stage companies, Chinese investors are learning about these technologies at the same time and at the same rate that we do, which precludes any time-based advantage for the U.S. Historically, the U.S. military has had exclusive use of critical technology for some period, which could be called overmatch. However, we are not likely to have overmatch in the future if China learns about leading-edge technology from U.S. startups at the same time we do. Fifth, without FIRMA, there is no monitoring, reporting, or control of China's investments in technologies important for national security. Lastly, the Defense Department, In-Q-Tel, or other parts of the U.S. government will tend to avoid contact with an early-stage technology company that has a significant level of foreign ownership, even if the company is developing critical technology. To mitigate technology transfer from the U.S., there are two primary tools the government has: CFIUS and export controls. FIRMA makes CFIUS more effective by expanding its jurisdiction to cover more transaction types that could include technology transfer. As I see it, the goal of FIRMA is not to ensure that more venture capital investments undergo CFIUS review, but to ensure that foreign investments are truly passive. Some have argued in congressional testimony that export controls are sufficient without FIRMA to deter technology transfer. There are 5 reasons why I do not believe export controls are a substitute for CFIUS reform. First, export controls have typically been used for products, not critical emerging technologies. In fact, I'm not aware of any critical emerging technologies such as AI, quantum computing, or genomics-based engineering which are on the export control list. Second, because export controls typically focus on products, in general, they mean more backward-looking. Third, export controls require coordination with allies to be effective, and this typically takes 2 to 3 years through the Wassenaar arrangement. Fourth, export controls are ineffective in deterring tech transfer that occurs when China forces companies to form joint ventures in exchange for Chinese market access. And fifth, enforcement is voluntary. I am skeptical that a Silicon Valley early-stage company is aware of the need for or is dedicating the resources to comply. Let me conclude with 2 important points. First, cooperation of allies. Any steps we take to deter tech transfer, which include both CFIUS reform and changes to export controls, needs to be coordinated with allies to be effective. Otherwise, we create an incentive for talent and companies to move offshore. Second, investment in science and technology. While defensive measures like CFIUS reform, better export controls are important, they are not the key to winning a technology race with China. The more concerned we are about the national security threat China represents, the more important it is to invest in science and technology, encourage Americans to pursue STEM education, and increase federally funded R&D. To enable the U.S. to win the last technology race with the Soviet Union, federally funded R&D was 2% of GDP in the 1960s. While China increasingly invests a higher percentage of its GDP in R&D and its economy grows faster than ours, U.S. federally funded R&D has declined today to 0.7% of GDP. We must be proactive to improve our technology base and innovation capability because our future economic prosperity will be the principal determinant of our national security. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Cinelli, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the invitation to appear before you today, and I am honored to join my fellow panel members as the subcommittee continues to evaluate the changes needed for CFIUS. Your leadership and that of Congressman Pittenger and Congressman Heck, as well as the bipartisan co-sponsors of FIRMA, demonstrates the foresight needed to manage the challenges we face today and the ones we will face in the future. I appear today in my personal capacity. This is my disclaimer. I apologize here. Not on behalf of my firm or on any client. The views presented in my written testimony and before you are solely my own. And again, I am grateful for the opportunity to share some observations and to respond to any questions you have. As part of my background, I had the privilege of serving in the United States Navy as a special duty intelligence officer for a number of years. And I had the opportunity to see the overlay between the legal issues that arise as well as those that appear when you are boots on the ground in various situations. That particular perspective, coupled with my legal career, helps me believe that FIRMA is essential to what this country needs. And in that light, I would like to focus my comments beyond what I've put in my written testimony to two key areas. First, the manner in which technology transfers occur in the cross-border environment, and second, the certain gaps in CFIUS's underlying authorities that affect the committee's flexibility to consider cross-border transactions as they shift and change, and this is regardless of the construct that we see. At the outset, it is important to recognize that since 1975, the statute has been amended reactively and generally to address a direct or perceived threat. In at least two of the three amendments, both 1988 and 2007, Congress responded to what it believed to be critical situations. One, related threats affecting U.S. semiconductor leadership, and the other involving gaps in the types of the transactions the committee could review and how. We find ourselves in similar circumstances today. The United States is at an inflection point. Technology leadership, the cornerstone of our U.S. economy, innovation, and security, is under siege. Many have focused the threat posed by China's assertive policies that are designed to close the gap or overtake U.S. leadership in a number of technology fields. But China is not alone in pursuing these objectives, although it is more organized and utilizes among the broadest set of tools to achieve these objectives, including acquisitions or investments in technology assets. Now, several factors contribute to the crisis, which I believe calls for congressional action. First, we face a diffusion and access to technology that continues to evolve and expand, and that is unlikely to change. Second, the concept of dual use, or as China refers to it, civil-military fusion, may be rapidly losing its relevance and viability. The application of a specific technology may be just as critical as the performance characteristics, and therefore, as you examine, for example, as my co-panel members have discussed, the export laws, may be important to look at exactly how those controls are utilized and how they affect CFIUS reviews. So, for example, the same technology used to manage data for tailoring product offerings to customers may also be used to identify trends that reflect terrorist activity. How that technology is discovered, managed, and accounted for remains a critical concern. And lastly, extensive cross-border investment occurs each year, much of it outside the purview of CFIUS and other regulatory environments. By some calculations, parties participate in 20,000 to 40,000 cross-border activities a year that result in some form of technology transfer. CFIUS receives and analyzes under these statistics a statistically insignificant number, leaving the majority of cross-border technology transfer activity potentially unreviewed. This lack of visibility affects government decision-making. FIRMA elegantly balances the twin goals of encouraging an open investment policy and protecting national security. Yes, it calls for foundational changes because, yes, we have foundational, almost cataclysmic threats and vulnerabilities. The legislation expands CFIUS authorities in a measured way and acknowledges the importance of maintaining a strong industrial base, employment base, and scientific leadership as the United States ensures that it has access to that which is essential to protecting its national interests. The proposed expansion of CFIUS jurisdiction is a direct result of the threats and vulnerabilities that we face, not an attempt to create an overburdened regulatory environment. I think it is also important to identify and recognize what FIRMA does not do. FIRMA does not limit the ability of the parties to independently assess whether a filing would benefit their transaction, nor does it preclude any specific transaction or establish any blanket presumptions of denials. It does not actually itemize the technologies of concerns, but it does establish a framework through which such technologies can be identified, especially in circumstances where in the past to do so has been inadequate. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we proceed to questions, the chair wishes to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter sent to the committee by the National Venture Capital Association, which lays out its recommendations to improve FIRMA. The NVCA is concerned, among other things, with the impact of the bill's passive investment language, writing, quote, "Unfortunately, the passive investment exemption is narrowly drafted and will cause harmless investment into U.S. companies to be picked up by FIRMA, thus causing delay for the company raising capital, needless cost and burden to the investor, and distraction for CFIUS from the true security concerns," unquote. Without objection, this letter will be made part of the record. And the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questioning. I'll start with you, Mr. Lowry. In your testimony, you expressed concern that FIRMA could perhaps unwittingly repeat the regulatory nightmare that is the Volcker rule. Why do you believe that this comparison is warranted?
My main rationale is for a couple reasons. One, there's a lot of language that's going to have to be defined in a rulemaking process. That rulemaking process is going to be difficult. I went through this back in 2007, 2008, when we went through CFIUS. It took us about 1.5 years to do that. It's going to take a lot longer to put these rules in place and to define these terms. And it actually leads towards anomalous results. In my testimony, I actually pointed out an example where if an American company was working in a foreign country and they basically transferred their technology and associated support to that country, that would not necessarily go through CFIUS. However, if that same American company was doing the exact same deal and doing the exact same technology and associated support, but it was in a joint venture where the American company actually had some percentage of the deal, that would go through CFIUS. Now, just metastasize that, and you're going to have an understanding of how difficult this is going to become. I just heard Giovanna say there's 20,000 to 40,000 transactions that are going on with technology cross-border all the time. How many of those are going to be captured under this bill? And how many of the ones that shouldn't be captured because they're not, because the corporate structure happens to be a different corporate structure? To me, at least, that's going to lead towards the complications that you see in the Volcker rule.
Mr. Marchik, as currently drafted, I think you testified that that the FIRMA bill could cast too wide of a net that would overwhelm CFIUS. How would that perhaps compromise national security?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I think as Clay said, the issue is how can you design a strategy, legislation that allows CFIUS to focus on those transactions that matter. I'll give you the commercial real estate example. The bill, and I think Congressman...
Is your microphone on? Sorry.
It is. Maybe
okay, yeah.
I think Congressman Pittenger has addressed this in the latest draft. In the commercial real estate sector, there are about 2,000 foreign investments in commercial real estate a year. Those transactions alone, if they were filed, would increase the number of reviews tenfold. And so therefore, it would overwhelm the system. Most of those transactions are not going to be sensitive at all, and it would force CFIUS to focus on non-sensitive transactions instead of taking the most powerful microscope and focusing on the transactions that truly threaten national security.
Let me ask anyone, and Mr. Brown, I'd love to invite you to chime in on this too. There's been an expression of concern from some of your fellow panelists here that there could be some unnecessary duplication or conflict between the export control system and CFIUS, and you addressed that a little bit about why you think export control alone doesn't do the job. Are you concerned about potential unnecessary duplication or conflict, and how do we need to structure this bill to make sure that there's coordination between CFIUS and the export control system?
Yeah, thank you. I think that they are both two sides of the same coin, and they both need to be looked at together. So to the point earlier, I think Clay might have said it, that we need comprehensive look at this problem. I think that's exactly right. And so it's not only what do we do on the defense side, which we talked about, CFIUS, export controls, but what are we doing proactively because we're in a technology race. But to your specific question, I don't think either one of these is a substitute for another, and I think some people are trying to say export controls can do the job alone. We already see that that's not working. So I would say, yes, we need to look at both, reform both. Let's go with FIRMA because that's right in front of us. Then let's look at export controls. And the most important thing that needs to be coordinated is what are these critical technologies? So we need, beyond the government, we need government experts as well as folks from academia and the private sector to help us with what those technologies are to narrow the scope of what we're trying to look at.
Mr. Lowry, in the remaining time, or Mr. Calmer and Marchik, any one of you, how can we avoid conflict or duplication between CFIUS and the Bureau of Industry and Security?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think the short answer is by building connective tissue, by building a bridge, and by ensuring that it's not two separate regimes working in parallel without communication, but in essence a conjoined whole where each side is doing what it does best in a way that together enhances national security.
Okay, my time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Marchik, you talk about most of these investments being made by companies based in allies of the United States. Did your analysis look behind to ultimate ownership? That is to say, the most controversial investment was American Uranium, which was purchased by a Canadian company. Just so happened the Canadian company was owned by Russian interests. Did you do the second-tier analysis in preparing your report?
It's a very good question because CFIUS and any other regulatory authority should ultimately look to the ultimate owner.
Mm-hmm. Does it do that now?
It does. I use the data from the CFIUS annual report.
So your report did as well?
I believe that they look at the ultimate owner. So if there's an intermediate company in the UK or Canada, but it's owned by the Russians, that should be a Russian transaction, not a Canadian transaction.
Gotcha. And I'll ask this to any witness, does CFIUS include expertise in protecting American jobs, or does it confer regularly with leaders of organized labor? Mr. Lowry?
In the last bill that was passed on CFIUS reform in 2007, the Department of Labor
Department of Labor. Very different from organized labor. Go on.
I understand. The Department of
Especially
Labor
in this administration.
The Department of Labor obviously connects with organized labor every now and then, and so they have an ex officio membership on CFIUS. They don't bring national security expertise. What they bring is to think about some of the issues I think that you're trying to get at. But in terms of, is there someone there who is worried about the economic security or job loss type of issues, that is not part of CFIUS currently.
Be interesting to go and campaign to our constituents and say, I stood firm in the Financial Services Committee against considering American jobs when we make international financial decisions. China walls off parts of their economy from our investment. Should we do something of equally, or does the fact that they wall off parts of their economy have no effect on our CFIUS decisions? I'll ask for Mr. Marchik or Mr. Brown.
I don't think we should be blanket cutting off a sector of our economy. I think we need
So
to...
China can do whatever they want to us, and we don't respond.
Well, I don't feel that way. I think what we
Well,
need
then
to...
how do we respond to them walling off whole areas of their economy from U.S. investment?
I think the work that we did on early stage investment says that we need to look at what we think are the critical technologies and ask ourselves whether we should allow China to invest in our startups. So I
Right,
wouldn't take
but I
an
mean,
entire
we
sector
obviously
away.
limit for national security reasons a very small portion of our economy. They limit a huge swath of their economy. Should we not limit a huge swath of our economy in response, or does the fact that they take such extreme action not affect us?
I think the answer there is to work with our allies to get China to change. So rather than-
Yeah, we've been working on that for 20 years, and the effect is huge profits for those who don't want China to change.
I would disagree. Getting out of the TPP is an example of not working with allies to affect.
Look, we've been doing this I'm going to move on. Now, should we explicitly state in this law that any Chinese company is viewed as an investment by the Chinese government, or should we engage in the fiction that Chinese companies are independent of their government? Mr. Lowry.
Well, my own view is that CFIUS is about looking at transactions in foreign direct investment in the United States on a transaction-by-transaction basis, so I think that we should actually look
But should we have a basic rule that if a company is under the control of the Chinese government or is situated in China, we evaluate that transaction as if it's an investment by the Chinese army and party? Or should we engage with China in the fiction that they're
No, I don't believe we should, but however, I will
We
say
shouldn't?
this. I
We
just
should
said it-
allow-
I just said no, but let me explain. Right now, the way that CFIUS works is there is an analysis done. It's called a threat analysis. The threat analysis is done by our intelligence community.
Should the threat analysis be directed by statute to regard Chinese companies as arms of the Chinese government? And I would say it should, and I'll ask any witness, can you mention a single time when a Chinese-based company has refused to do the work of the Chinese intelligence service of the Chinese government? Yes, do you have an answer?
If I could just answer that, just 2 seconds.
Since they always do the work of the Chinese government, why shouldn't they be regarded as arms of the Chinese government?
I think perhaps if the perspective, we might be imposing the U.S. concept of corporate law on the Chinese. We have distinctions between state-owned enterprises and corporate constructs. The Chinese do not. So perhaps if you're examining it from a statutory perspective, looking at whether it's a state-owned enterprise or part of the
We should
PLA.
regard them all as arms of the Chinese government. I yield back.
The time has expired. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Williams from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman Barr, and thank you for holding this hearing today and for your leadership on the important issue of CFIUS. This is the fourth hearing this subcommittee has held about the important tool, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and other members of this committee to discuss the legislation before us. To all the witnesses before us today, thank you for your testimony. Foreign investment in the United States greatly improves the outcomes of millions of Americans by creating jobs and developing groundbreaking technologies. However, nations such as China continue to grow their influence through investment in the U.S. and other nefarious tactics. In this discussion, my goal is to find a solution that protects our national security, which is paramount, while at the same time allows the American economy to continue to reap the benefits of foreign investment. So my first question is to you, Mr. Lowry. As you know, everyone in this room wants to update CFIUS to bolster our national security without harming foreign direct investment that strengthens both our economy and ultimately our military. That being said, many CFIUS experts, including you, are concerned about the unintended consequences of FIRMA. In particular, you write that duplication of other government national security programs may hamper the effectiveness of this legislation. So can you expound upon these concerns?
Thank you, Congressman. Let me just state very clearly, I have the exact same objectives that you do, that Congressman Pittenger does, that Congressman Hecht has, which is to bolster our national security, especially from any type of investments that could create a problem. The concerns I have are largely, not solely, but largely about the outward bound provisions within the bill, because it will overwhelm the system that is currently in process. Thousands of transactions will have to be looked at as opposed to hundreds. These are transactions that are in lots of different areas. You're from Texas. There are energy companies that do joint venture operations around the world. That is considered critical technology, okay? Critical technology transactions. So all of those transactions would now need to go through a CFIUS process. Their competitors who come from countries like France, by the way, from China and from other countries, will not have to go through that process. That to me strikes me as anti-competitive, and I don't think that it necessarily gets us to where we want to get to, which is to try to actually address, as Mr. Marchik said earlier, the focused problems that are real national security concerns, not all the everyday transactions from multinational companies.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, our troops should never go into a fair fight and should always be able to overmatch their opponents in the field of battle. You've learned about this during your time at the DOD and refer to it in your testimony. And I represent Fort Hood, and one of the largest military bases we have in the world. And the soldiers I represent rely in part on policymakers like me to make sure they are not barely winning their fights, but instead have the tools necessary to dominate their opponents. The military needs to be able to turn out innovation and technology faster than its enemies to maintain overmatch. So with that being said, to what extent is China already encroaching on our military superiority?
I think to a large extent, and I think many of the officials from DOD have already talked about that, Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, et cetera. The answer to me is twofold. One, on the defensive side, let's make sure we spend the time to identify what are the critical technologies we care about, whether it's AI, quantum computing, so that we can narrow the scope of what the CFIUS transactions would be, but to the critical ones. And then proactively, we have to invest more to make sure that we are leading this race. We want China to be looking to us as the source of future technology, not us chasing them. But that requires us to be much more proactive in terms of what we're investing in.
Next question, is CFIUS currently equipped to stop important American military technology from being acquired by the Chinese and other bad actors? You might be as detailed as you can on
that. CFIUS needs to be strengthened so that it covers more of these transaction types, because today CFIUS is largely looking at when majority control happens. But if the Chinese are making investments in a critical technology, a quantum computing startup, say, today CFIUS would not cover that unless there's majority control. So I think that's a huge strategic gap that was talked about before that we've got to close with FIRMA.
Okay, thank you. I yield my time back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member as well, the witnesses for appearing. I especially thank my colleagues, Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Heck, for the time and energy and effort that they put into this piece of legislation. Mr. Lowry, you indicated that this legislation would cover a circumstance wherein there is no merger, there is no foreign investment. Would you explain, please?
Yes, sir. This is the provision that it's sometimes referred to as the JV provision, but it's basically about capturing outward bound transactions. So there's no investment into the United States in any way. Instead, it is a United States company doing business in a foreign country, and they're doing that business, and it's going to be in a technology field or in an infrastructure related field. And under the legislation, CFIUS would now need to review it and look through it and do an evaluation as to whether or not that should go forward. That's happening all the time. Thousands of transactions are happening like that from different companies all over the map within the United States. My concern is that that is about, if there is technology that is of concern to the United States, we should define it and then control it. And that's what the export control regime is for. CFIUS is about inward-bound investment into the United States. So that's why I'm supportive of those provisions largely within the FIRMA bill put forward, but not this specific provision where it's about outward-bound transactions.
Does someone else have some additional intelligence on the point?
Well, I just think that the outbound transactions are another source of tech transfer. So though it might not involve inbound technology or investment, we want to have some say on whether critical technology is being transferred through a forced joint venture. So I think we got to define what are those technologies, and we need to define what are the countries we're concerned about, and I'll just name it. It's China. It's not all countries. So the CFIUS process, we've got to give some credit for the folks running that process to streamline it once they're dealing with thousands of transactions versus hundreds. But I think the joint venture or outbound technology flow is a critical gap we need to fix.
Mr. Calmer, that was Mr. Brown for the record.
Great, thank you, Mr. Green. The longer this, the more we discuss this, the clearer it is to us, I think, that we are all in, I think, almost total agreement about the diagnosis here. It's the concern about emerging critical technologies going to China and potentially other places. And so I think about David's analogy to the ER, which also seems appropriate in thinking about how one might address that issue in legislation. I mean, a patient comes to the ER complaining of chest pain. You don't bring in an orthopedic surgeon. You go to the cardiologist. This is about finding the right tool. And so it just seems to us we've got that tool. It's the export control system. And as Representative Roy said in the opening comments, export controls aren't just about physical products. They can cover technology. They can cover information. They can cover services. They can even potentially cover transactions through the sanctions law. They can do so by identifying the destination that people are concerned about, the end use that people are concerned about, the end user that people are concerned about. The infrastructure is there. It is true, as a practical matter, the infrastructure isn't working the way we need it to address this threat, but we've got the tool. In fact, there is authority tomorrow if somebody were to identify an emerging critical technology of concern that was on the verge of being exported, say, to China, to actually impose a unilateral control on it. That's not ideal. Ideally, we do that in a multilateral fashion, but as a short-term measure, we've got the tools. That's our perspective on this.
I have 22 seconds left. Anyone else? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield back the balance of my time.
You know, the gentleman yields back in the remaining time. The gentleman, I would invite Mr. Brown to respond to that, if you would.
The adequacy of export controls?
Yes.
Yeah, I agree that theoretically export controls could be covering a lot more, but I think practically they don't. I mean, let's just think about the voluntary nature of export controls. That means that companies that are quite aware of their obligation in the defense industrial base, for example, devote a lot of resources to making sure they comply. But I'm particularly concerned about emerging technologies and small company development of those technologies. Those companies are not aware and not spending the resources to ensure they comply. How many convictions do we have for violations of export controls? We don't have anywhere near the number of resources looking at what's happening there in critical technology. So I think it's a huge flow of outward technology that, while theoretically could be covered, is not.
Okay. The chair now recognizes the author of the legislation, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, for the record, with unanimous consent, I'd like to enter two letters, one from Oracle and one from Ericsson, in support of FIRMA. Oracle stating critically, FIRMA strikes a balance of protecting national security while not chilling the benefits of foreign investments in the United States. We appreciate the language is narrowly tailored to focus on specific national security concerns, distinguishing between investments that are financially motivated and investments that are strategically motivated, such as improving foreign military capabilities or other strategic objectives. Ericsson states, in short, FIRMA helps provide the assurance by arming CFIUS with the tools necessary to preserve our national security interest while not discouraging investment in the United States. It is an important effort in a regulatory area that requires modernization, without which will result in the potential compromise of technology developed by companies like Ericsson and, in turn, our national security.
Without objection, those letters are entered into the record.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Calmer, thank you for your testimony. I was correct to say that you do have various entities that are part of your group. I know that these two are part of your group, but Lenovo is part of your group as well. Is that not correct?
That's right.
Does that in any way affect your testimony, do you believe?
No.
Mr. Marshak, Carlisle has many investments, probably billions of dollars in China, maybe 50-plus companies. Do you believe in any way that that affects your testimony?
No, sir. In fact, my testimony is very similar to my testimony in 2006.
Well, we have Asia Satellite Telecom Holdings. We have Caribbean Investment Holdings, currently East River Biochemical, GDC Technological Limited. These are major interests in terms of technology and services. I would just want that for the record. Yes, I think it's important and material that it be known. Mr. Lowry, do you have representation of foreign investments in China?
No, I do not.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, I would like you to elaborate on outbound investments. That seems to be the real sticking point here. And the shortcoming, in essence, of what would happen without the CFIUS review and outbound investments. And frankly, to the reason why we have 5 Secretaries of Defense ministers, Secretary of Defense and the current Secretary, both parties, stating that we had to reform CFIUS to address these joint ventures in these foreign countries, particularly China.
Yeah, happy to. I think the issue is if you have a critical emerging technology which is not yet covered under export controls and a U.S. company wants to enter the Chinese market and China forces you to have a joint venture, that's a tremendous opportunity not only for IP to leak out, but also know-how, and also an opportunity for China to recruit talent.
Could you give us some examples?
Well, there would be lots of examples that would cover some of the military technology we talked about. So imagine if it was Boeing or GE with jet engines. I can understand why a company might want to enter a joint venture to have access to the Chinese market, but I think we need to have a say in whether that makes sense from a national security standpoint. And the closer you get to emerging technologies where we don't even understand yet where they're all going, artificial intelligence, quantum computing and sensors, areas like that, we need to be hypersensitive about that technology inadvertently leaking.
Once it begins as a commercial venture with a dual technology objective, it can morph into a military interest. Does export control have the capability to give purview over that?
My understanding is export controls theoretically do, if we were smart enough to put on the export control list critical emerging technologies, but I would ask us whether that has happened. So I don't think practically we're looking forward enough with the export controls. It tends to be more backward looking.
CFIUS has a dozen agencies involved, whether it be Commerce, Justice, the Intel community, DOD. Do these same eyes looking over the shoulder of export control, or do we have the same type of purview?
Clay might be in a better position to answer that. I don't think it's as broad as CFIUS is.
Well, I think that's the concern that many of us has, is that CFIUS, by structure, not just Commerce leading the way, but the Treasury with multiple agencies who have a direct interest in the outcome.
I'll just, in the export control, the Defense Department, the Commerce Department, and the State Department take the lead on looking at it on export control matters.
And I would like to say we've addressed oil and gas, and they're happy with our bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to also, also note for the record that I personally believe that some, if not many, of the comments made here earlier with respect to outward bound relate more appropriately to 2.0, not the latest version of the bill that we have been developing. I know many of you are familiar with it because many of you were involved in the improvement of 2.0, and I thank you again for that. Mr. Calmer, I frankly want to particularly cite the constructive role that ITI played and thank you for that. We don't really have time, I don't, to go into a really technical discussion of some of those things, but I would like to ask if you'd be willing to respond to some questions for the record about the revised version of the bill that we did enter into the record earlier.
Happy to do that. There may be some confusion about which version is 2.0 and 3.0.
We're going to help you with that.
Okay, that would be great.
We're going
Dates would help.
Trust me, we're going to help you with that.
Great.
Mr. Brown, I've often referred to your work, the report that you co-authored at DIUX about Chinese investment in early stage companies and wider technology transfer. It's an honor to have you here today. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I actually came to Congress from the private sector. I've been involved in startups. I've grown companies. I've served on board of directors. I acted as an angel investor. And I think I'm well aware, frankly, of how it is that somebody who makes a less than 50% plus one investment in a company might gain access to emerging technology or to other technologies that would be of interest to us. So I want to ask you, how does simply making an investment even potentially result in damage?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think it takes kind of the next step to see what are the tools China uses for technology transfer, some legal, some illegal. So the investment per se, you could argue, as I think you're suggesting, there's not really a problem with that. But if you use the investment as a view of the landscape, and we talked before about China in aggregate having a view to upwards of half of all the venture activity, which is a lot of innovation happening in the US, that gives you a vantage point to then deploy other tools, cyber theft, placing a foreign national at companies. And there are examples, some classified, some not classified, which are examples of that. A perfect one is the Sinovel American Semiconductor case. 60 Minutes did a report on that 2 years ago. National Public Radio covered it again just this month. You have a wind turbine manufacturer in China, and you've got the controls of the key software coming from a US company, and then that was effectively stolen using industrial espionage. They converted one of the employees to then provide the tools and put the American company out of business. And John Carlin, Assistant Attorney General, was asked in the 60 Minutes report, how often is this happening? Thousands of companies experiencing this. FBI did a survey of 165 companies a couple of years ago. Half said they had suffered some form of theft, IP theft, and 95% of those cases attributed to China. So this is a rampant problem happening around us, and it's because China has a very systematic, well-funded plan to transfer technology. It's critical for transformation of their economy, and it's happening through those illegal means we just talked about, but also through very aggressive recruiting, Spring Light, 1,000 Talents program. It's happening through professional associations where they do recruiting, joint ventures they want to do from a research standpoint with US academic institutions and US companies. So they're doing it in a variety of different ways.
Well, even frankly, short of theft, I fast rewind, imagining that the last company I was involved in, which had a couple of modest software proprietary products, if we had an investor that did not have a seat on the board but had 40% of equity, hard to imagine they wouldn't have a seat on the board, but conceivably, it just would be prohibitively impossible to deny the flow of that information to them in one way or another. That's just a straightforward fact of the matter.
Exactly right.
You make some recommendations on how to deal with technologies transfer strategy in the report that you co-authored, but like any good report, you included a no action alternative. What happens if we do nothing?
We're in a technology race with China. Our economic security is at stake. So the longer we leave the barn door wide open without taking the appropriate defensive actions, it's as if we're saying, we're wide open, please come steal whatever you'd like. And I think that has to be balanced, as we've already talked about, with what are we doing in the US to proactively invest and make sure we're on the leading edge of technology and innovation. So I think we have to do both.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Calmer, in testimony before the Financial Services Committee and the Senate Banking Committee, officials representing the Department of Commerce in the Trump, Obama, and George W. Bush administrations have all testified that export controls not only restrict the transfer of products, but even ideas. According to his Commerce Assistant Secretary Richard Ashu, export controls can make fine distinctions between countries and even end users. Former Commerce Assistant Secretary Kevin Wolf has noted that in contrast to CFIUS reviews, a transaction isn't even necessary. A phone call or an email can be covered through export controls. Can you explain your member company's interaction with the export control regime and elaborate on why you believe export controls are more appropriate than CFIUS to protect national security when it comes to outbound transfer of technologies?
Sure, would be happy to do so, Representative Emmer. It is, and I say this all with humility because I am not personally an export control expert, but have been fortunate to work with our member companies' experts as well as some others. Our companies are on the front lines, as are companies in other sectors of doing business across borders, of moving things and ideas and services and so forth. And all of our 63 members are global, sophisticated companies. They have significant departments of people thinking about these things. And I would say uniformly in the discussions that we've had on this issue, people have agreed this is where the solution set lies. And in complete agreement with Mr. Brown, actually, we're not there yet practically. The system is not working with the necessary aggressiveness and creativity and resources to help control and discipline the things that we're all worried about. But people from our companies know from personal experience, from transactions and exports that their companies rely on, that that's the tool. That's the tool that's going to get us there.
Thank you. Mr. Lowry, the medical device industry, which is a major driver of my state, Minnesota's economy, has expressed concerns with the proposed expansion of CFIUS oversight and how it could impact technologies that may not have been initially thought of when this effort began. Of particular concern is the broad application of the term critical technology and the term emerging technologies. While it's possible that implementing regulations will help define the scope based on the bill's definition, we don't see any guarantees. Based on your experience, is it your sense that medical devices would or would not be covered under the umbrella definition of a critical or emerging technology as proposed in the current legislation?
Congressman, I don't know.
Should they be?
My view is probably almost assuredly not, unless there is some way you can relate that back to our national security, which I'm not sure if you can. That's part of my concern, is that there are a lot of definitional issues that have to be clarified through a rulemaking process, which will be difficult. We've tried to do lots of different definitions on critical technology in the past, but it's also linking that critical technology, because there's lots of critical technology that has very little to do with national security. How do you link those together? So my unfortunate answer for you is I don't know.
May I try, sir?
Absolutely.
To me, this goes back to my testimony. Clay's right. The answer is I don't know. If there is a medical device technology that helps our troops, that is unique, that is something that is in our comparative advantage, that helps our military, the government should focus on whether we want to let that technology go.
Well, if I can interrupt you, everything that you just said, if there is a medical technology in advance that not only helps our troops, it will help every citizen in the United States. It could help people around the world. Why should that be included in critical emerging technologies and denied to other people that may actually survive because of it?
I think the point is that the government, through the export control system or some other method, should decide with whom do we want to share this technology, okay? If it is some type of technology that protects troops against chemical weapons, for example, I would think we would want to control that, where it goes, who we want to share it with, and of course it would benefit everybody, but we need to look out for our own troops.
True, but we also have to be interested in innovating, and in order to innovate, we may not have all the ideas. We need to bring others in. So I guess my concern is still my concern that the definitions are not defined. They are too broad. We need to make sure that we're not having unnecessary impacts on industries such as this. And I know that all of you feel the same way, but somehow that has to be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for your expertise, and I thank Mr. Pittenger for trying to address this. I share some concerns about how broad the language is and some of the implications that have been already discussed. And so to pick up where Mr. Emmer left off, you know, I guess, you know, to continue with you, with Mr. Marchik, if I have, as an entrepreneur, an idea, it's innovative, perhaps it's critical. How do I know it's critical? And let's say it is deemed critical by you or some other decider on behalf of the United States of America. Who owns the idea? Is it my idea or is it America's idea?
It's certainly your idea, sir.
So I own my intellectual property.
Correct.
And I decide to, I don't even necessarily want to patent it, I just have it as a trade secret. But somehow somebody discerns that what I'm doing might be critical or sensitive. It's not even sold to the military, but it's important to somebody. When can the government come in and take possession of my intellectual property and decide that I no longer have control of that intellectual property?
They should never do that. It's your intellectual property.
So, Mr. Lowry, how does the language in this bill, what implications does that have? You know, we have, I think, tighter language on the export control protocols. It's already very critical. We've seen problems and gaps, to be sure, with export controls. One of the notable ones to me is when it first moved to Commerce Release Authority, when Hughes basically gave away the farm on multiple launch vehicles for rockets. Same to put communication satellites out, because it also launched warheads with great precision. So where does that line happen between the tight language of export control and where we're headed with CFIUS?
So I think it's a great question. If it was CFIUS the way it currently exists, if your technology and your intellectual property, you decide to sell it to a foreigner, and that foreigner comes in and gets control of it, and that technology or that what you've created, your intellectual property, is considered to be something that is of a national security interest, then the government has a say in allowing that transaction to happen. It may allow it, it may not allow it, but it has a say. If you take it and you want to provide it overseas, and it is technology that has not been controlled by our government, whether it is the Defense Department, which has the ability to do this, the Commerce Department or the State Department, then that is something that you're allowed to do. Under this bill, you would basically, that would be expanded to something so that you would now have to go through another investigation to look at that, even though all you're doing is selling it to somebody in Brazil. And that concern is, instead of identifying that your technology is a concern to us from an export control basis or national security basis, we're now basically just saying it because it's a critical technology, and we've created something where the people that have no experience at this are now going to have to look at it, as opposed to the people that did have experience at this.
So do you have any suggestions on how we could tighten that language and make it clear? Because, you know, if you think about some of the most innovative minds, a lot of these are like grad students, they're in a PhD program, they're thinking, how do I commercialize this? They don't know that some bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. is thinking this might be critical technology. They're just looking at how do I commercialize my idea? And they start talking to somebody. They may not even have a clue what the beneficial ownership of the company is. Right. And we criminalized some of this behavior is the concern. So how could we get that language tighter, in your opinion?
So I think that Mr. Brown, I think, made some really excellent points about this. The export control language right now is not understood very well in the startups type of thing. If you think that's not understood, can you imagine what CFIUS is like? And so my own view is that if you're going to tighten that up, then we need to identify those technologies, and we'll probably have to do some marketing about that. Right now, at least our export control regime tries to do some of that, but probably not as well, and Michael Brown has pointed this out, as they should. In CFIUS, we've done no marketing practically. You would have to do a ton of it if this bill becomes a law.
Thank you. And my concern is America is the land of innovation. We create all kinds of innovative technologies, and I would hate to see the most brilliant minds on the planet find that they should create their intellectual property somewhere else because we've put a regime in place that discourages innovation and capital formation. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth.
Happy Thursday. I appreciate everybody being here. I will try not to reiterate what everybody else has said because much of what I wanted to talk about has already been said, but I do want to make a couple of points. First, my disclaimers. Number one, I think we should do something, right? The status quo is unacceptable. Number two, the work that Mr. Pittenger and Mr. Heck have put in is really, really great work, and much of it I absolutely agree with. But like we've discussed earlier, there is some aspects that I really do disagree with and worry about the chilling effects it may have on U.S. investment abroad, right, or investment here in the U.S. And I don't think this is you're either pro-China or pro-America. I'm pro-America. I'm pro-American business. I'm pro-American innovation, and I want us to continue to be a leader around the world. And I think we do that because of, as Mr. Davidson said, those trying to develop intellectual property here, because they have control of that intellectual property here. And I want to make sure that we continue to do that. And I want to empower American business to be able to compete around the world and generate resources around the world that they can invest in R&D right here. But I do want to find a solution to this problem, like I said. I want to make sure that we get to an answer that works for CFIUS, an answer works for export controls, and ultimately works to keep the American people safe, right? And I think that is a really important step that we need to take. And I do worry, I share many of your concerns, right, that by making CFIUS overly broad, we've taken what was working and now we've spread those resources over so much more ground. We're going to do everything with mediocrity instead of doing the things we need to do extremely well. And I worry about that in many aspects of government. I feel like we're headed that same direction. What I've heard from Mr. Brown and others in testimony is there are some gaps between what we should be doing and what we are doing with export controls. That to me doesn't say, hey, we need a whole new structure that we got to build on top of everything. That says we need to address those gaps. And let's put the things on export controls that need to be on export controls. Let's take the steps we need to take with export controls. But let's not build a new superstructure that catches so many more transactions, that takes valuable resources and spreads them over more and more territory, more and more transactions. So I wanted to ask Mr. Calmer specifically, in your testimony, one of the things you talk about is my area of exact concern, right? Section 3A5BV, and how we might be able to add Section 109 language to the existing bill in order to really narrow that to transactions that could pose a national security threat rather than having the broad language, the broad net that we're using now. I would hope that you would address that a little bit more than the few sentences that you've got in your testimony.
Sure, happy to do that, Representative Hollingsworth. And I should first say, appreciate the comments, Representative Heck, about working together. This portion of the bill is the portion that we've been most concerned about, but where I think in recent months we've seen the most good faith responsiveness to those concerns. And now, whether it's 2.0 or 3.0, we're talking about language that, from our vantage point, recognizing we're not in Congress, is moving very much in the right direction.
Good.
What we, in my testimony, and we have done it more broadly in our proposed edits, envision is, in addition to the possible idea of incorporating Section 109, actually putting into FIRMA and establishing under CFIUS a subcommittee, what we would call a subcommittee on export controls, to perform the function of being this connective tissue. I mean, one of the beauties of CFIUS as it is today is that I think it's got all the export control agencies in it already. And so I certainly remember, and I'm sure Clay does, that there are many transactions where you get in the room, you're looking at the transaction, you're like, wow, can this be dealt with by export controls? And you've got the experts from the Bureau of Industry and Security sitting right there. The idea is to essentially turbocharge that process, ensure the two sides are talking to each other, and to the extent that this subcommittee can be a vehicle for increasing funding, political commitment, and institutional expansion of export controls, we believe that over time, that it can actually do the hard work that we think we need to do up front of identifying, describing, and listing emerging critical technologies.
Well, I want to do that work up front, right? I want companies to be able to know the vast majority of technologies that exist out there, the vast majority of transactions that exist out there, the vast majority of countries we are not concerned about. We want you to go about your ordinary course of business and transact as you see fit and do things. It is a narrow band that we are concerned about, and focusing on that narrow band so that we do that well is really, really important, because I am pro-American business, I am pro-American employment, I am pro-American national security, and I think that really means we have to be careful here that we don't dampen U.S. investment or alternatively inhibit our companies from being able to compete around the world, to do transactions around the world, so they can bring back that money to invest in R&D, so they can bring back technologies from the world right here and make our lives as Americans better off. So thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back, and with the indulgence of the witnesses, there's an interest in a brief second round of questions, and I'll start that second round of questions. I think Mr. Brown makes an interesting and important point that I think that I would like the other witnesses to address. That point being his view that the export control system is deficient, and that FIRMA and an expansion of the CFIUS jurisdiction is necessary to the extent that the export control system remains deficient. I also would like Mr. Brown to address the very interesting and I think important point that Mr. Lowry makes, that the FIRMA bill as currently drafted runs the risk of, quote, overwhelming the system. So let's start with the first point that Mr. Brown makes. Mr. Lowry, Mr. Calmer, Mr. Marchik, would you like to address Mr. Brown's point that the export control system is deficient to achieve the objectives we want?
So Mr. Brown makes, I think, and I know Giovanna has also made some of those points. My own view is that if there are deficiencies, then let's work on them and let's fix them. And I think that Congressman Royce's bill has made a very good effort at that. The dialogue we just heard is about how do we improve the FIRMA bill and link it towards the improvement on export controls. If our concern is that export controls are not covering enough, particularly towards specific countries such as China, then let's address that, instead of creating basically a bill in CFIUS which addresses all countries outside of a few, but mainly all countries, and addresses all technologies even though they're not necessarily ones that are of concern to us. So I think that there's, I agree with Mr. Brown. If that is, I think it sounds like he's right, which is we need to work on it, but then work on, as Mr. Calmer said earlier, the right tool for the right problem.
If I could shift back to Mr. Brown. So in response to that, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at Chairman Royce's legislation updating the export control system. Would that solve the problem primarily, and if it doesn't, why not? And then if you could also address the argument that the FIRMA bill as currently drafted could potentially overwhelm the system and spread resources too thin. I think Mr. Hollingsworth's concern.
Sure. So my perspective, as I already said, is we need to reform both. Neither is a substitute for the other, and given the scope of the problem and how critical it is for our future, why wouldn't you want more tools in the hands of the U.S. government? So I'm all for improving export controls. I'm not an expert on Mr. Royce's bill, but I very much favor updating that and making sure a list of critical technologies that are forward-looking would be included in what we do to update export controls. But I don't think that's a substitute for CFIUS and the ability to look at investments that are incoming in the U.S. In these technologies that we might want to be concerned about. To your question about overwhelming the system, I think we handle that by two things. Number one is, to the extent we can define a process to name these critical technologies, and I agree it's overly broad right now, that process needs to include not just government input, but again, academia and some private sector input. Let's make sure we're getting a broad view, and of course that'll have to be dynamic. Once the list is there, it's out of date immediately, so we need to think about that. And then narrow the list of countries. I think we've used some examples here, was it some selling to Brazil. let's be very clear about the countries we care about. I don't think the bill is so politically incorrect to name those countries, but I don't mind naming them: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, Syria. Most of those are irrelevant because they're not investing in our economy, with the exception of Russia and China. And China's an order of magnitude bigger than Russia can invest. So I think getting very specific is a big plus. And then second, we need to give credit to the very smart people working on CFIUS. If they have to deal with thousands of transactions and they get the resources from Congress, they're going to figure out how to sort the wheat from the chaff and focus on what are the transactions that we care about. I know they're not going to look at every transaction. We get equal time. I've met those folks working on CFIUS, and it's a very smart group, and they would adapt.
I appreciate the deeper dive on those issues. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of my colleagues on committee know I'm a movie buff and love to quote lines from movies. I'm thinking today about a line the Kevin Costner character in The Postman used, which is, "Things are getting better." And I think things are getting better in this bill as a consequence of this really incredibly healthy conversation from all points of view. And again, I want to thank the chair, and I want to thank my partner, Congressman Pittenger, in his advocacy, but all the people who are bringing their heartfelt concerns to this table. I cannot help, however, and I'm sorry that my friend and colleague from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, left, comment on his concern about placing in a law a regime that would thwart innovation, and my words, not his, effectively dilute, demean, appropriate someone's intellectual property, because it's important to note here what it is that requires a society of innovation. It requires investment in research and development, and as Mr. Brown pointed out, we're way down from where we used to be, but that's part of that previous federal investment is part of what got us where we are. It includes the finest post-secondary education system on the face of the planet. That helps create our society of innovation. It includes, most importantly, and germane to the subject, freedom of expression. Because you know what? They don't have that in China, or North Korea, or Russia, or Syria, or Iran, as a matter of fact. And lastly, it requires the rule of law. Indeed, the very concept of intellectual property is a product of Western law, originally Great Britain, but developed through law and case law in America. Intellectual property is the rule of law, and it's that which enables innovation, and it is, in fact, that which we're trying to protect with CFIUS, as a matter of fact. So I wanted to make that point because I don't think it should be overlooked, how we got to where we're at and what's at stake here. Ms. Cinelli, you haven't been called on in a long time. I think you've got a lot to offer. So if I may, ma'am.
I'm feeling left out. Yes.
No more.
Thank you.
You noted in your testimony that one of the factors that makes it particularly urgent that we act now is the loss of visibility into the technology transfers that are occurring. I want you to elaborate on that. I want you to say a bit more about what you mean by it, and how can modernizing CFIUS help solve that problem?
Happy to do so. And I thank my co-panelists here for providing all the background. So if you look at the export control regime and then you look at CFIUS, each is voluntary in a certain sense. If someone does not make a filing to CFIUS, there's no visibility by the government into the activity. And yes, the committee can reach out and invite a submission, but even in those circumstances, it's voluntary. So governments make decisions on what is critical to needs, what the next generation is, sometimes on the information that they obtain through these processes. And so without the filings and without an understanding of how the constructs work, the government is missing some information. And on the export control side, I must express a little bit of frustration as people were talking about the system, because as a general matter, the export control system is structured to handle some of the outgoing and even incoming exchanges that occur. The challenge arises in that you can control something, But if you do not require an authorization from the government in order to address the exchange, to have the exchange occur, then you still have no visibility. In essence, something is put on a list, but there is no need to go to the government to let them know. You invoke what are called license exceptions or license exemptions. And I know this is not an export hearing, but there's built into, especially the commerce regime, at least 18 authorizations that are self-executing, that if a company looks and says, I meet these elements, they may proceed with a range of technology transfers without any notice to the government. There is no filing with customs, there's no filing with census, there's no filing of anything, reporting of any sort to the government. So the activity occurs lawfully because the exemption or exception permits it, but the government is unaware of it. And so if it then proceeds to make decisions, as Mr. Brown was mentioning, you publish a list, and by the time you publish it, it's outdated. This is today's technology, and you put it on the list. It takes 6 months to get it on there, and it's already been overcome by events. So as you look to fix the system and examine HR 5040, one of the things to look at is how are these exception and exemption processes working. CFIUS and the modernization, what it does is it allows even more visibility into all these different types of activities. And the agencies that are involved in CFIUS are also the ones engaged in the licensing part. There is a section in the existing bill, I've not seen 3.0. It's, I believe, might be 5C Romanet 3, which actually says that certain transactions are not covered if there are other laws and regulations that can address it. Again, I'm not quite sure what happened in 3.0, but that provision in and of itself opens the door to put the contours and framework on preventing the deluge that has been discussed here. And I think perhaps that provision should be looked at a little bit more closely to see how it can be used to cabin in some of these issues.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The chair recognizes the vice chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Williams.
Mr. Marchik, in your testimony, you advocate for a carefully tailored approach to determine which transactions actually need national security review and allow for speedy review for the rest. So my question would be, how would you effectively determine which transactions do and do not need national security review?
It's a very good question. I think that there are criteria in the existing statute. I think FIRMA expands those criteria. Those criteria give companies guidance on which transactions are the type of transaction that CFIUS needs to review. And then going back to something that Mr. Brown said, you want to make sure that CFIUS captures those transactions where there's something greater than passive investment. You could have an investment where there's an 80% ownership stake and they're completely passive. They just say, give me the financial statements, do a good job. If you do a good job, we'll give you more money. If you don't do a good job, that's our last investment with you. You can also have an investment that's 10% or 20%, which includes licensing of technology, sharing secrets, being on boards, access to supply chain information. If that's in there, CFIUS should review it. So I think you look at indicia of control, the type of transaction that involve, whether there's sensitive technology, and that gives you the guideposts for which type of transactions need to be reviewed. Going back to Mr. Hollingsworth's point, which I think was very well taken, the system has slowed down so much because they're overwhelmed that frankly, non-sensitive, non-significant transactions are getting slowed down. I'll give you one example. We had a transaction of a medium-sized company. It wasn't particularly sensitive. We loved it. It was a good investment that we sold to a NATO ally. It flied through CFIUS. On the 29th day, we got a call. There was no concerns at all. 29th day, we got a call that said one of the agencies can't get the signature because this person is traveling around the world. So that added another 30 days to the process. And as Mr. Hollingsworth said, that chills investment. If I'm selling my house and Mr. Lowry bids X and Josh bids X plus 10%, and Mr. Brown bids X plus 50%, but he's going to take 6 months to close and may not close, I'm selling to one of these two. because time is money, and that uncertainty and the slowing down of the process is what hurts finance, what hurts investment, and chills the type of innovation that Mr. Hollingsworth has talked about.
Okay, Mr. Lowry, let me ask you and Mr. Marchuk this. When we consider the option of dividing countries into more concerning and less concerning, is it accurate to say that risky actors may come from friendly countries and still warrant review by CFIUS?
Yes, it is. So the way the system works now is that, and I think it should remain this, is that a foreign investment comes into the United States, it comes from a different country because it's foreign, and the intelligence agencies try to basically figure out how much of a threat is it. So if the threat is going to be a lighter threat if it comes from the United Kingdom and it happens to be a purely private company. But it may be a much heavier threat if it comes from China, and it's whether it's private, to Mr. Sherman's point earlier, or it's a government-controlled company, the threat level is going to go dramatically up. That is how CFIUS is actually doing its calculation. They're looking at that threat, and then they look at the vulnerability of the asset that's being purchased. So I was involved in a transaction that was coming from a NATO ally where they were purchasing something in the United States, and we didn't allow that transaction to occur under CFIUS. And it was because the asset that was being purchased was so sensitive. Not the purchaser wasn't sensitive. It wasn't a problem. It was what they were buying was a problem. And so we didn't allow it to happen. Now, that had nothing to do with China. I promise you, it was a NATO country. But it just suggests sometimes it's not as clear-cut as deciding which countries and which, but that's why there's a process.
You've got 16 seconds, Mr. Marchuk.
I agree with Clay. There's a balancing between the country of origin, the buyer, and the sensitivity of the asset, and CFIUS needs to weigh those factors.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Mr. Pittenger is recognized.
I'd like to thank each of you for being here today. I value your input, and we have the last several months. We'll continue to modify it. I hope that all the members will take a hard look at version 3.0 and see the modifications we've already made to industry, because I am a free and fair market guy, and I believe in capital investments. I have the largest Chinese-owned hog processing plant in the world is in my district. So I welcome those investments. Those are 5,000 people who have good jobs there, and I don't want to discourage that whatsoever. So don't hear my interest in this in any other realm. I would say that we're not alone in our concern. Japan has real concerns in this regard. Germany, the UK, European Union, Australia. We are all about addressing a major exploitation of our IP. And to that end, it's important that we try to lead the way and to get it done right. I would like to say that one part of our bill that is included is an exemption that really makes it more marketable, more accessible for companies when we have other countries who have the same standards that we have. And it's incentive for them to address these issues. And as such, they have a minor form they've got to fill out, in essence, and don't have to go through the process. I would ask you, Mr. Lowry, is the CFIUS process, is it voluntary or mandated?
It's currently a voluntary process, but there are ways to bring companies.
Yes, sir. If after the fact that there's some opportunity to review, if something, question is raised, but it's really a voluntary process. So we're really not talking about 20,000 applications or concerns that would necessarily come in. Treasury, from my discussions, doesn't expect anything close to that because it is a voluntary process. It isn't mandated. So I would say to each of us, let's continue to work together. I would, Ms. Sinelli, you wanted to make a comment earlier, I could tell, and I just want to give you a moment to do that.
Thank you very much, sir. It's a very interesting comment on the transaction that you were talking about. Just from a very practical perspective, when people put deals together and there are CFIUS closing conditions, which some do get inserted, there are usually also provisions for what we call closing over the condition. So from a very practical perspective, if you were to get the kind of information that Mr. Marchik was talking about, where it was a more administrative process that was impeding the finalization, just as a practical matter, the parties believed the risk would be appropriate in that sense, and they would close over the condition. In that sense, it would not impede the investment, they would stay to the schedule. Where some challenges may arise sometimes is if there isn't a particular view from CFIUS, and maybe they haven't been as clear that it's an administrative matter, then the parties may hesitate. But even in those circumstances, in my experience, a large number of transactions move forward even if there is a CFIUS closing condition. It is considered part of a business calculation, just like tax and any other consideration. Thank you.
I would just add that I agree with that, but in our experience, we're a firm that doesn't like to close unless the government says you can close.
Mr. Brown, would you like to make a closing comment?
I'm glad that this committee has taken this issue so seriously, so my thanks to Representative Heck, Chairman Barr, you for taking the leadership on this issue to make sure that we do something, because the fact that the bill has some areas that we may want to improve is certainly no reason not to move forward and strengthen national security. So I'm excited about what I'm
Do you have any concerns in terms of outcome of what may or may not happen in a bill that would allow further exploitation?
As several of you have already commented, no single action we take is comprehensive. So
Yes.
I think we need to move forward with improving, and then we need to say, what else do we need to do to take care of the threat? Export controls we've covered here in depth, but then as I became a broken record, we've also got to look at what are we doing to invest to make sure we're the source of innovation in this country. So
And I think we all agree that export control and CFIUS play a vital role, and they both need to be enhanced. And frankly, export control is the frontline defense from my point of view. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pittenger. And Mr. Hollingsworth, you're recognized for.
Well, as I said before, much has been said, so I'll be the once more with enthusiasm here at the very end. I really appreciate everybody's expertise. A couple of things I wanted to say. I wanted to reiterate exactly what Mr. Heck has been a vocal advocate for, and I as well, in increasing R&D spending, both on the public side and whatever we can do to engender more on the private side. The source of our innovation in the long run are truly those investments. And wanted to comment on what Ms. Chinelli said as well. I mean, let's be fair to our friends over at Commerce. The goal is not to have everybody submit a letter to the government when they seek to do a transaction that's across a border, right? The goal is to make sure that we limit it to those specific instances and not have everybody suddenly submitting forms just because they happen to go across a random geographic border. And so I think it's really important to say there are exemptions in place, but there are exemptions in place for good reason, right? And again, I think we come back to this point, which all of us have talked about, in narrowing down the focus so that we capture every single transaction that could be a problem, but not one more transaction than that. That's the goal. And I wanted to reiterate what Mr. Marchik said. I bought and sold a lot of companies nowhere near what Carlisle has, by the way, and trying to...
You have a few more you can look at?
Right. And really healthy valuations, I'm sure, right? Trying to convince a buyer to close over conditions is just one more hurdle in a transaction and not always an easy proposition, especially with something as big and onerous as federal government standing at the side of that. So I wanted to just come back to this very central theme, right? One, I don't believe we should do nothing. I think we should take steps to enhance national security. Two, I do think that we should address the gaps in export control and utilize that, as Mr. Pittenger said, frontline measure, and have a robust list, a clear list of these are the things that are really important to us to hold on to. But three, I want to come back to this underlying point, and I think it was touched on a few minutes ago, which is what we are really concerned about is technology transfer, right? And CFIUS uses corporate transactions as a proxy to understand what might be happening underneath the hood in terms of technology transfer. And I think export controls in a very real way gets at the actual underlying transaction we are worried about. And I want to make sure that we fully utilize those resources and don't build an extra superstructure over top of that and use a proxy when we could just use the underlying problem that we want to deal with. And I think the last point, and we've all talked about it, is making sure that we stay very, very focused here. Because I did worry, and Mr. Brown, I agree with so much of what you said and so many great points, but when you start to list the things that could be on an export control list, right? I mean, there's so much pure academic research that theoretically sometime in the future could have a military application. I don't want to start putting everything on the list because it might end up in the hands of a military use later on. I want to make sure that we're really focused on the things that we think are proximate or near term or could be, because I don't want to end up with a list that just basically says everything, right? And then we get to the point where everybody's submitting a letter, where everybody feels like they have to go through a process, where everybody pays a $300,000 fee to enter CFIUS, right? I want to make sure that we get through and allow American business to succeed here, allow them to succeed around the world, so that we can reinvest in all these important things that we talk about in R&D. Private companies have to pick up the slack from a federal government that is not investing in R&D the same way they were 20 or 30 years ago. And I don't want to put them at a disadvantage to be able to do that because of the work that we do here. We already fail to fund in the full, robust way I think we should. I don't want to then tie up companies' hands paying more, and forgive me for those of you that are lawyers, but paying more legal fees, right? Instead of paying more researchers and R&D and more facilities and employing more Hoosiers back home. And so I think these are all really important points. As Mr. Brown well said, everybody's taking this very seriously. As Mr. Heck and Mr. Pittenger have both said, they have made tremendous strides, invested unbelievable diligence in making sure we get to the right outcomes here. I think we're very close. I think Section 109 language is really important to making sure that we narrow the Section 3.5 issues that I have, and I just look forward to continuing to work with everybody and appreciate the testimony today.
Thank you. Gentleman yields back, and I want to thank all my colleagues for their valuable contributions and important, insightful questions that helped us understand this a little bit better, and thank our witnesses for their excellent testimony today. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for the response. And I would ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. This hearing is now adjourned.